Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The last carriage to Raven Hall. The Brambleworth Railway Station Cafe was an island of bustling, temporary warmth against the encroaching December chill of 1908. The air, thick with the ceaseless murmur of conversation and the steam from an endless service of tea, fogged the grand windows, blurring the edges of the world outside into a swirl of white. Snow, which had begun as a gentle, festive dusting, now fell with a quiet insistence, tapping against the frosted glass like restless fingers. For everyone else, this place was a brief pause on a journey home. For Evangeline Hartwell, it was the end of the line. She sat alone at a small wobbly table, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her. The telegram, its stark black letters a brutal slash against the creamy paper, lay crumpled by her saucer. Mrs. Abernathy passed peacefully in her sleep. Services no longer required. Just like that, the last 4 years of her life, of being useful, of having a place, had been neatly folded and tucked away. She was no longer a governess, simply a woman suspended between worlds, with a ticket back to a sister's charity she could not yet bear to use. The cafe door opened with a gust of frigid air and a jingle of bells, and he entered. Lord Adrian Blackwood shook the snow from the shoulders of his greatcoat, his movements economical and precise, yet tinged with a weariness that seemed to settle deeper than the cold. His hair was the colour of wet slate, his jaw firm, but it was his eyes that held her. Across the crowded room they found hers, dark, guarded, and holding a sorrow so profound it felt like a shared secret. Evangeline looked away, a flush rising on her cheeks. It was improper to stare, a lesson drilled into her since childhood. A governess was meant to be invisible, a placid and unassuming fixture in the background of other people's lives. But in that fleeting moment she had not felt invisible. She had felt seen. Adrian's gaze lingered. He saw not just a pretty, solemn woman in a simple woolen dress, but the way she held herself, a stillness that was less about composure and more about a quiet bracing against an unseen blow. He saw the tremor in her hand as it hovered over the teacup, the unshed tears that gave her grey eyes the luminous quality of a winter sky just before dawn. He recognised the look of someone unmoored, adrift on a sea of polite, festive chaos. He crossed the room, his footsteps muffled by the din, and stopped at her table. "Pardon the intrusion," he said, his voice a low baritone, smoother than she had expected. "But you have the look of someone whose destination has just changed without warning." Evangeline's head snapped up, her heart giving a startled little flutter. Up close, his eyes were even more striking, flecked with hints of amber like last autumn leaves trapped in ice. She should have offered a polite dismissal, a murmur of denial. Instead, the truth slipped out, raw and unguarded. "And you," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper, "have the look of someone who understands that feeling." The ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting, melancholy thing. "I do," he admitted. He gestured to the empty chair opposite her. "May I?" She nodded, a small, jerky motion. He sat, placing his leather gloves on the table. The rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the station clock seemed to grow louder, measuring out the seconds of this strange shared silence. Outside, the snow was now a thick, swirling curtain, erasing the world. "This storm is getting worse," he observed, his gaze drifting to the window. "The station master just announced the last train to London has been cancelled. Nothing is moving until it passes." A fresh wave of panic washed over Evangeline. Stranded, utterly and completely stranded. Her meagre savings would not stretch to a hotel room for an indeterminate number of days. The carefully constructed wall of her composure began to crumble. Adrian saw the shift in her expression, the flicker of fear that replaced the sorrow. It was an impulsive thought, one born of a loneliness that mirrored her own, a reckless disregard for the rigid rules that governed his life. "My carriage is waiting," he said, the word surprising even himself. "I'm headed to my estate, Ravenhall. It's only a few miles from here. The roads will be difficult, but passable for now." He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. "There is more than enough room. You could wait out the storm there. It would be no trouble at all." The offer hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. A lord and a governess. It was scandalous. It was unthinkable. Her sister's voice, sharp and disapproving, echoed in her mind. "Know your place, Evangeline." But her place was gone. Her destination had vanished. All she had was this moment, this station clock ticking toward an unknown future, and the gaze of a man who looked at her not as a servant, but as a fellow traveller whose journey had been unexpectedly rerouted. She began, her throat tight. "Please," he said, and the single word was not a command but a plea. "I confess the prospect of being snowed in alone at Ravenhall is a bleak one. I would be grateful for the company." In his eyes she saw it again, that flicker of shared recognition. He was not just offering her shelter, he was admitting his own need for it. And in that moment of raw honesty, the societal rules that had defined her entire life seemed to melt away like the frost on the window pane. She gave a small, decisive nod. "Thank you, Lord Blackwood," she said, her voice finding its strength. "I accept." The carriage was a world unto itself, a dark, cocoon-like space smelling of old leather, damp wool, and the faint, clean scent of snow. Inside, the roar of the wind and the clamour of the station were replaced by a profound, muffled quiet. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak of the suspension, the soft jingle of the harness, and the steady, muffled thump-thump-thump of the horses' hooves on the snow-covered road. It was a sound like a slow, steady heartbeat, measuring the passage of time in this strange liminal space. They sat opposite each other, their knees occasionally brushing when the carriage swayed. The landscape outside was a ghostly watercolour of white and grey, the trees' skeletal figures draped in ermine, the fields vast, empty canvases. The journey became a metaphor for their situation, suspended between a past that had just ended and a future that was entirely unknown. For the first mile the silence was thick with unspoken questions. Evangeline held her hands tightly in her lap, her mind racing. She had just entrusted herself to a complete stranger, a nobleman whose life was as far removed from hers as the moon from the earth. And yet she did not feel afraid. She felt a quiet, thrumming curiosity. It was Adrian who spoke first, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fill the small space. "Ravenhall was my father's pride," he said, his gaze fixed on the shifting snow outside the window. "He collected it, the way some men collect art or horses. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every ridiculously ornate teacup was chosen to project an image of power and permanence." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. He never seemed to notice that his wife was fading away within its perfectly decorated walls. The confession was so unexpected, so deeply personal, that it took Evangeline's breath away. This was not the idle chatter of a lord making conversation with a temporary guest. This was a glimpse into the guarded fortress of his heart. "You speak of it as if it isn't your home," she ventured softly. His gaze shifted from the window to her face, and the vulnerability in his eyes was startling. "It isn't," he said simply. "It's my inheritance, my duty, a beautiful prison I never asked for. I was the second son, you see. My brother was meant to be the Lord. I was meant for a quiet life, a scholarly one. But then, fate had other plans." He didn't need to elaborate. The weight of his unwanted title settled between them. His honesty unlocked her own. "I understand," she found herself saying, the words tasting of a truth she rarely spoke aloud. "Being what others need you to be. My sister believes my only value lies in my utility. To be a governess, then a wife, then a mother, a series of roles to be played. I've spent so long being what others needed me to be, I've forgotten what I might want for myself." She looked down at her gloved hands. "I fear becoming a permanent burden, always living on the edge of someone else's life, dependent on their charity." "Then perhaps this storm is a gift," he murmured, his voice gentle. "Time to remember." Their bodies swayed together as the carriage hit a rut, and for a moment his hand instinctively reached out to steady her, his fingers brushing her arm. The touch was brief, a fleeting spark of warmth through the thick wool of her coat, but it sent a jolt through her that was anything but fleeting. It was electric, significant. She looked up at him, and the air in the carriage grew thick, charged with a new awareness. The space between them no longer felt like a formal distance, but a taut magnetic field. She saw the way the dim light caught the sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. He saw the soft curve of her lips, the intelligence and sorrow that warred in her lovely luminous eyes. It was more than just shared loneliness now. It was a spark, a flicker of mutual attraction, of recognizing a kindred soul not just in circumstance, but in spirit. Two people, displaced by duty and loss, finding an unexpected and dangerous understanding in the heart of a winter storm. The horses slowed, and Adrian leaned forward to peer through the window. "We're here," he announced, his voice a little thicker than before. Through the swirling snow, Evangeline saw it. Raven Hall. It rose from the white landscape, not like a house, but like a piece of the winter itself. All dark stone, sharp gables and towering chimneys that seemed to scratch at the bruised purple sky. It was magnificent, imposing, and profoundly lonely. It was a perfect reflection of the man who sat before her. And for the first time in a very long time, Evangeline Hartwell felt a tremor not of fear, but of anticipation. The storm did not abate. For 3 days, Ravenhall was an island in a silent white ocean. The snow fell relentlessly, burying the world and trapping them within the manor's stone walls. The servants, all of whom lived in the nearby village, were unable to make the journey, leaving the vast, echoing house to its reluctant lord and his unexpected guest. The grand silence of the estate, which Adrian had always found oppressive, was now filled with the small, intimate sounds of two people simply existing together. Their days fell into a strange and comfortable rhythm. In the mornings, Adrian would build a roaring fire in the library's cavernous hearth, while Evangeline, surprisingly resourceful, navigated the cavernous kitchens to produce toast and coffee. They would eat at a small table, the great dining hall with its ghostly sheet-draped chairs ignored. These ordinary acts, performed in the extraordinary context of their shared solitude, became charged with a quiet intimacy. The library became their sanctuary. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, with towering shelves of books that smelled of leather and time. Here, the weight of their disparate social stations seemed to dissolve among the words of poets and philosophers. Adrian, who had confessed his preference for tending gardens over managing ledgers, seemed most himself in this room. He showed her his father's collection of botanical illustrations, his fingers gently tracing the delicate hand-painted petals of a long-extinct rose. He appreciated their beauty, Adrian said, his voice soft, but I don't think he ever understood their resilience, what it takes for something to grow in difficult soil. "I think I do," Evangeline replied, her gaze meeting his over the fragile painted leaves. In the evenings, by the flickering light of the fire and a single oil lamp, they would read aloud. Adrian's voice, A deep and resonant baritone gave new life to the prose of Dickens and Hardy. But it was when he asked her about her own passions that the last of her defences truly began to crumble. "You spoke of wanting things for yourself," he said one evening, closing the book he'd been reading. The firelight danced across his face, softening its aristocratic lines. "What are they?" Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of the small leather-bound journal tucked away in her valise, filled with the cramped secret scrawl of her poetry. It was the only part of her that was truly her own, unshaped by the expectations of others. "It's nothing, really," she demurred, her cheeks growing warm. "Just foolish scribbles." "I doubt that," he said, his gaze gentle but persistent. "Nothing about you is foolish." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding hers. "Read me something you've written." "I couldn't," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "They're too honest." "Then they're exactly what I need to hear," he insisted softly. His sincerity was a key, turning the lock on a door she had kept bolted for years. Hesitantly, she retrieved her journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it to a page filled with a poem about a ship lost at sea, searching not for a harbour, but for a piece of the sky to call its own. She began to read, her voice a low, tremulous whisper at first, then growing stronger as the words took hold. When she finished, a profound silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle and hiss of the fire. She dared not look at him, her face burning with a mixture of terror and relief. "Evangeline," Adrian said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached across the space between them, his fingers gently touching her chin, tilting her face up to his. "That was beautiful, and not honest at all. It was the truest thing I've ever heard." His face was inches from hers. The air grew heavy, electric with a longing that had been building for days. She could see the firelight reflected in the dark pools of his eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She wanted it more than she had ever wanted anything. Her lips parted slightly in anticipation. He leaned closer, his gaze dropping to her mouth, and the world seemed to narrow to this single, perfect, terrifying moment. Then, a log in the hearth shifted and collapsed with a loud crack and a shower of sparks breaking the spell. Adrian blinked, pulling back as if startled, the charged current between them suddenly broken. A shadow of his old guarded self flickered across his face. "The fire," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse and practical. "We should bank it for the night. It will be a cold one." The moment was gone, but the memory of it remained, a burning ember in the quiet, snowbound heart of Raven Hall. The thaw came as abruptly as the storm. On the fourth morning, Evangeline awoke to a world transformed. Sunlight, pale but brilliant, streamed through the mullioned windows of her guest room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The oppressive silence of the snow had been replaced by a gentle, rhythmic dripping as icicles melted from the eaves. The world was stirring, reawakening, and with it, reality came rushing back in. A groom, dispatched by Adrian the day before with a message to inform Evangeline's sister of her safety and whereabouts, had finally managed to return through the thawing snow. He carried a small sack of general post, but he delivered a specific sealed letter to Evangeline first, a letter he had collected directly from her sister's hand. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and impatient. With trembling fingers, Evangeline broke the seal. A moment later, a sharp knock came at her door. It was Adrian. He held a telegram in his hand, his face a mask of grim resignation. "My mother," he said, his voice flat. "She expects me in London. The social season is beginning. She has, in her words, arranged several promising introductions. A strategic marriage is expected." They stood in the hallway, the brilliant morning light a cruel mockery of the sudden darkness that had fallen between them. The fragile, magical world they had built within the snowbound walls of Ravenhall was dissolving like the frost on the window panes. The outside world, with its rigid rules and suffocating expectations, was demanding their return. "So, you will go," Evangeline stated, the words tasting like ash. It wasn't a question. "It is my duty," he replied, the words stiff, formal. "And I have mine," she said, holding up her sister's letter like a shield. "A position in Yorkshire awaits." The space between them crackled with unspoken words, with the ghost of the kiss that had never happened. Evangeline turned to go back to her room, to pack her meagre belongings, to fold herself back into the small, neat box of her former life. She could not bear to look at him, to see the reluctant lord who would do his duty, just as she would do hers. "Don't!" Adrian's voice, raw and urgent, stopped her. "Don't go!" She turned back slowly, her heart a painful drum against her ribs. "What would you have me do, my lord?" she asked, a bitter edge to her voice she could not contain. "Stay here? In what capacity? Your charity case? Your secret shame to be hidden away when your promising introductions come to call?" The word struck him like a physical blow. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. The cold mask of the aristocrat was gone, replaced by a desperate, aching vulnerability. "As my equal," he said, his voice thick and hoarse. "As my choice." He let out a ragged breath. "Evangeline, I am afraid. My father's neglect was a kind of violence. It hollowed out my mother until she was nothing but a beautiful, brittle shell. I am afraid of that power, of caring for someone only to destroy them. And I'm afraid of being a burden," she cried, the tears she had held back for so long finally spilling over. "Of being a thing that is cared for, but never truly wanted for who she is." "I want you," he breathed, his forehead pressing against hers. The words were a warm puff of air against her skin, a vibration that travelled straight to her soul. She could smell the cold morning on his coat, the scent of old books from the library and something else beneath it all, a scent of earth and will that was purely, intoxicatingly his. "I want your honesty, your resilience, your foolish, beautiful poetry. I want all of it." His mouth found hers then, not as a deluge, but as a discovery. It was a kiss of profound recognition, a tasting of the truth that had lived between them since that first glance across the station cafe. His lips were firm and searching, and she answered with a lifetime of unspoken need, her own mouth softening, opening for him. It was a silent, desperate conversation. Her hands, no longer hesitant, wove into the thick hair at the nape of his neck, her fingers pressing into him, claiming him as he was claiming her. He groaned, a low sound from deep in his chest, and his arms banded around her, lifting her until there was no space left between them, just the frantic beating of 2 hearts. He carried her back into her room and kicked the door shut, the sound a final, definitive closing off of the outside world. There were no others here, no sisters, no mothers, no duties, only them. He set her down gently, his hands framing her face. His fingers trembled as they went to the tiny buttons of her bodice, his eyes never leaving hers, asking a question his lips did not form. Her own hands, clumsy with need, went to his shirt, her palms greedy for the warmth of his skin. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with the heat of their shared urgency. He paused, his hands stilling over her heart. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice breaking on the words. She looked up into his dark, earnest eyes and felt a profound shift inside her. This was not a surrender. It was a choice. Her choice. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady and clear with a power she had never known she possessed. She reached up, her hand tracing the line of his jaw. "Adrian, I am sure. A look of profound relief and a love so tender it stole her breath washed over his face. He leaned in and kissed her again, not with the desperate hunger of before, but with a slowness that felt like a sacred vow. It was a kiss that erased all the silence and distance of the past months, a gentle pressure that spoke of promises kept and futures yet unwritten. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones as if she were the most fragile, precious thing in the world. He drew her closer until her forehead rested against his, and they simply breathed together, sharing the same air. The morning sun streamed through the window, bathing them in a warm golden light that felt like a benediction. She felt the steady, reassuring beat of his heart through his shirt, a rhythm that grounded her, telling her this was real. This was not a dream born of a snowstorm. This quiet room, this man, this feeling of rightness. It was solid. It was truth. Pulling back just enough to look into her eyes, he didn't need to speak. She saw it all there, the last of his fear melting away, replaced by a certainty that mirrored her own. The world outside, with its telegrams and duties, was a faint, distant echo. Here, in the golden light, was everything that mattered. This choice, this reckless, beautiful, terrifying reckoning that felt finally, not like falling, but like being safely caught. It was grace. 6 months. A lifetime. The journey to Yorkshire had been a flight into a self-imposed exile, a penance for a joy she felt she had not yet earned. Evangeline had taken the post with the grim determination of a soldier marching into a necessary, joyless battle. She had to prove, if only to herself, that the woman who had unravelled in Adrian's arms was not a creature of weakness, but one of choice. She had to know that her own 2 feet could carry her before she could ever choose to walk beside another. The Cunninghams' house in Yorkshire was a monument to new money and old misery, perpetually smelling of boiled cabbage and damp wool. The 4 children were not malevolent, merely neglected, their boisterous energy a chaotic whirlwind she was meant to tame. Her days were a grey, colourless litany of multiplication tables, corrected posture, and lonely meals eaten on a tray in her small cold room. It was a life of perfect, respectable utility, and every night she would stare out her window at the smoke-stained sky and feel a hollowness so profound it was a physical ache. This was the life she was supposed to want, the security she was raised to covet. It was a cage. After 3 weeks of this silent purgatory, his first letter arrived. The thick cream-coloured paper and the sharp, elegant slant of his handwriting were a shock of colour in her monochrome world. It was not a plea. It was not a declaration of undying passion that would have felt unearned, premature. It was simply a conversation, picked up as if they were still sitting by the fire in the Ravenhall library. Evangeline, it began, without title or formality. The snow has finally melted from the north-facing slopes. I found a patch of early crocuses near the old oak today, a most defiant and startling shade of purple. It made me think of your poetry, the way it finds beauty in things that have to fight to be seen. I hope you are well. I hope you are writing. I encourage you to submit your poetry to a publisher, she wrote back, her own hand trembling, describing the industrial sprawl of Yorkshire, the surprising wit of the youngest Cunningham boy, the way the sunset turned the factory smoke into something almost beautiful. It was a cautious, careful letter, a testing of the waters. His reply was faster this time. He told her of his mother's furious reaction to his refusal to come to London. She has declared me a lost cause, which I find to be a most liberating diagnosis. He wrote of his plans for the estate, not as a lord commanding, but as a man asking for an opinion. I am thinking of opening the library, he wrote. What use are all these words if they are locked away in the dark? I imagine the village children, their hands smudged with dirt, turning these pages. Do you think it a foolish idea? And so, Their correspondence became the true foundation of their intimacy. Through ink and paper, across 100 miles, they built something real. They debated philosophy, shared passages from books, and confessed their fears. She told him of her crippling doubt, the voice of her sister in her head telling her she was reaching above her station. He told her of his terror of repeating his father's mistakes, of becoming a man who possessed beautiful things, a house, a wife, but cherished nothing. "You're not him, Adrian," she wrote, her pen flying across the page in a moment of fierce clarity. "You cherish everything. The flowers, the books, the people. You see the fight in things. That is not your father's legacy. It is yours." It was also during this time, bolstered by his unwavering belief in her that echoed through his letters, that Evangeline took the greatest leap of her own. She submitted her poetry to a publisher in London, and to her profound, earth-shaking astonishment, it had been accepted. It was Adrian's letter, arriving just days after she received her own life-altering news, that prompted the offer. A man who cherishes things needs help to care for them. The library project is moving forward. It needs a leader, a guide. It needs a head librarian with a poet's soul and a quiet strength I have seen in no other. The position comes with a salary and the old gardener's cottage by the stream, a place of your own. It is a real position, Evangeline. This is not charity. It is a proposition. Come home. She had resigned the next day, and now she stood in the Ravenhall Conservatory, the morning sun filtering through the vast panes of glass, warming her face. The air was humid and sweet with the scent of damp earth, jasmine, and the delicate perfume of 100 blooming orchids. She ran a hand over the velvety petal of a deep crimson rose, the Evangeline, as Adrian had quietly named the new hybrid he'd been cultivating. It felt like coming up for air after a lifetime underwater. The conservatory door opened with a familiar soft creak, and Adrian entered, carrying a small copper watering can. The transformation in him was even more striking in person. The haunted, guarded Lord of Winter was gone, replaced by a man at ease in his own skin. The weight of his title now sat upon his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle he wore with a quiet, purposeful confidence. He smiled when he saw her, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes and made her heart perform a familiar, joyful leap. "Good morning," he said, his voice the same soft baritone that had filled her dreams for months. He came to stand beside her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. His arm brushed against hers, a simple touch that was no longer the illicit spark of their first acquaintance, but the comforting, grounding contact of a kindred soul. "It is," she agreed, her gaze sweeping over the profusion of life around them, a living testament to his patience and care. "Everything is growing." "It requires patience," he said, his eyes meeting hers, and in their dark depths she saw the entire history of their 6-month correspondence. "And faith, tending to something without any guarantee of a bloom." He was not just talking about the flowers. He was talking about the trust they had placed in each other, the space they had so carefully given one another to grow. He had not rescued her from Yorkshire. He had provided the soil and the sun, and trusted her to find her own way to the light. And she, with her letters of encouragement and unwavering belief, had done the same for him. "I've learned," Evangeline said, her voice full of a certainty that felt as rooted as the ancient vines clinging to the conservatory walls, "that some carriages don't take us away from home, they bring us to it." He set down the watering can, the copper glinting in the sun, and took her hand. His fingers laced through hers a perfect, seamless fit. It felt natural, inevitable, the quiet, triumphant culmination of a long and difficult journey. "Then let's never stop travelling together," he murmured. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of their reckoning, born of fear and frantic hope. It was not the almost kiss by the fire, heavy with unspoken longing. This kiss was a conversation they'd been having for months. It was tender with memory and deep with abiding affection. It tasted of promises kept and a future earned. It was the kiss of two whole people, partners in a collaborative creation, finding their union not in a moment of reckless passion, but in the slow, deliberate and beautiful work of building a life. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "My mother is still appalled," he said, a note of soft laughter in his voice. "But she was quite impressed by the publishing contract. It seems a poet is a far more acceptable partner than a governess." "And my sister," Evangeline countered, a smile playing on her lips, "has decided that being the librarian of a grand estate is, at least, a respectable eccentricity." They laughed together, a quiet shared sound that filled the warm sunlit space. The sun rose higher, streaming through the glass, and in the quiet, green, breathing heart of Raven Hall, a new season had finally, irrevocably and beautifully begun. Love on the Air. The world for Clara Vance began at 4:30 a.m. in the hushed cathedral-like quiet of the WROA studio. It was a space consecrated by routine, scented with the holy trinity of her professional life, the crisp, clean fragrance of freshly printed paper, the faint electric tang of ozone from the broadcast console, and the bitter ghost of yesterday's coffee. Here, in the sanctum of her soundproof booth, she was the master of her universe. Her voice, a smooth and measured alto, was an instrument she played with meticulous care for the listeners of City Sunrise, her news and culture segment that unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch. Her notes were colour-coded, her timing impeccable. Chaos, in Clara's world, was a myth. In the adjacent studio, chaos was signing off. Leo Croft's laughter tumbled through the thick glass, a warm, unruly sound that always seemed to defy the soundproofing. He was wrapping up the night shift, a freewheeling 3-hour conversation with the city's insomniacs, dreamers, and lonely hearts. Clara could picture him perfectly, leaning into the microphone as if it were a confidant, a stray lock of dark hair falling over his forehead, the worn leather of his jacket smelling faintly of the night air. He treated his callers not as an audience, but as old friends, their shared jokes and easy camaraderie a stark contrast to her own polished formality. The red on-air light above her booth flicked off. Clara allowed herself a small, controlled exhale. Another perfect broadcast. She began methodically organising her scripts into a neat pile when her monitor blinked with a message from Brenda, the station manager. "Vance, Croft, my office. Now." Brenda's office was the station's nerve centre, a place where idealism met the harsh reality of spreadsheets. She sat behind a large desk, her expression one of grim pragmatism. "Close the door," she said, without looking up. Clara sat in one of the stiff guest chairs. Leo ambled in a moment later, folding his long frame into the other, with a casual grace that she found inexplicably irritating. "Good morning to you too, Bren," Leo said, his voice still holding the warm gravel of his late-night broadcast. Brenda finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over them both. "I'll cut to it. The quarterly numbers are in and they're not good. We're facing significant budget cuts. As a result, we're consolidating. City Sunrise and the night shift are being eliminated." A cold knot formed in Clara's stomach. She felt the neat stack of her scripts, the product of years of dedication, slide into a chasm. Leo leaned forward. "Whoa, wait. You're cutting both our shows?" "Not exactly," Brenda corrected, a faint, almost predatory glint in her eye. "I'm merging them. Congratulations, you two. Starting Monday, you're the new hosts of the 6 to 10 a.m. drive time slot." We're calling it Morning Rush with Vance and Croft." The silence in the room was absolute. Clara stared at Brenda, then at Leo, whose charming smile had finally vanished. He looked as horrified as she felt. Her, the queen of the prepared statement, and him, the jester of improvisation. It was not a merger, it was a collision. Their first show was, as Clara later recorded in her journal, a delightful disaster. She tried with valiant effort to stick to her segment on a recent city council meeting regarding zoning variances. The proposed ordinance, R22-5, would rezone the waterfront district for mixed-use commercial and residential properties, Clara began, her tone even and informative. From across the console, Leo chuckled. "Hold on, Vance, let's translate. The city wants to let bigwigs build shiny condos where old man Fitz's bait shop has been for 50 years. Let's get a caller on the line. Sal from the south side, you're on the air. What do you think about these mixed-use shenanigans?" Clara's jaw tightened. He was a force of nature, a hurricane in a soundproof room, and she was standing in the centre, holding a script that may as well be a single useless leaf. "While personal anecdotes are valuable," she interjected, her voice tight, "the specifics of the ordinance are crucial for public understanding." "Come now, Vance," Leo's voice was a playful prod, a velvet-wrapped barb. "Don't you ever feel the urge to throw the schedule to the wind? Tell us what you really think about the city's new parking meters. No notes, just feeling." The tension arced between them, a live wire of genuine annoyance and an undeniable crackling electricity. The hiss of static before a connection was made seemed to echo the space between them. And then the phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree. A woman named Joyce called in, laughing. "I love you too. You sound like my husband and me trying to decide on dinner." Another caller, a gruff-sounding man, said, "This Croft fellow's a menace, but damn if it isn't entertaining. Keep it up." By the end of the show, the station's social media was buzzing. The term hate flirting was trending locally. Brenda was waiting for them when they came out of the studio, a broad, triumphant smile on her face. "That," she declared, "was fantastic. The numbers are through the roof. Whatever that was, that oil and water, fire and ice thing, lean into it. It's gold." Clara looked at Leo, who was running a hand through his already messy hair. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, beneath the horror, she saw something else. A flicker of shared astonishment. They'd created a beautiful, chaotic mess, and the city was listening. The shared space, once a battlefield, slowly transformed. Brenda's decree that they plan the show together forced them into a reluctant armistice. Their battleground shifted from the on-air studio to the cramped production booth and the station's small, perpetually messy kitchen. Late-night planning sessions, which began with heated arguments over segment timing, gradually bled into something else. One evening, hunched over a stack of listener mail, Leo pointed to a letter praising Clara's segment on the Historical Society. "You really love this stuff, don't you? The dusty old facts." "I like stories with clear narratives," Clara replied, her guard firmly into place. "Things that are preserved. There's a comfort in it." She hesitated, then added, "My grandfather owned a used bookstore. I grew up surrounded by them." It was a small offering, a crack in the pristine wall of her persona. Leo didn't mock her. He just nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that," he said quietly. "I learned radio by recording stories on a tape recorder for my little sister. She was sick a lot. I'd make up these wild adventures to make her laugh." He shrugged, a gesture that was surprisingly vulnerable. "Guess I never stopped." In that small exchange, amidst the clutter of coffee cups and discarded notes, the characters of Vance and Croft faded, leaving just Clara and Leo. Their reluctant truce was tested when Brenda sent them on a remote broadcast to the city's annual food festival. It was a miserable, rainy afternoon. They were huddled under a small broadcast tent, the cheerful festival atmosphere dampened by a persistent drizzle. Halfway through their first segment, a gust of wind sent a sheet of rain sideways, shorting out their main mixer. Clara felt a familiar surge of panic. "We have dead air. We have to cut to commercial." "No, wait," Leo said, his eyes bright with a challenge. He pulled out his phone, plugged in a small professional-grade microphone, and hit record. "All right, folks, welcome to the real morning rush. Our equipment has officially surrendered to the Great Deluge of 25, so we're coming to you guerrilla style." He held the phone between them and pulled Clara closer under the small awning, their shoulders pressing together. "I'm here with the unflappable Clara Vance, who is currently trying not to murder me with her eyes. Clara, describe the scene." Something in his infectious calm disarmed her. "The scene," she said, a small genuine laugh escaping her lips, "is soggy. A man just had his prize-winning pumpkin pie turn into a pumpkin soup. The mayor is hiding under the hot dog stand." Leo bought them a shared cup of hot cider, the cardboard warm against their cold hands. They passed it back and forth, their fingers brushing, huddling together as they gave a wonderfully authentic, hilarious play-by-play of the dissolving festival. It was their most popular segment yet. The true turning point came a week later. A prominent city councilman, their lead guest, cancelled 5 minutes before he was due on air. Clara felt the world tilt. Her entire second hour was built around him. The colour-coded script in her hand was now useless. She froze, the silence stretching. Then Leo's voice, calm and steady, filled her headphones. "Well, folks, it seems Councilman Davies has had a change of plans, which brings us to a new topic, the best-laid plans gone awry. Call us with your stories of disastrous vacations, ruined weddings, and job interviews gone sideways. We've all been there." He handled the calls with his signature blend of humour and empathy, weaving a brilliant tapestry of shared human folly out of thin air. He had thrown her a lifeline, not with a grand gesture, but with quiet competence. After the show, the studio was silent. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a strange intimacy in its wake. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't quite meet his eyes. "Any time, Vance," Leo replied softly. She finally looked up. He was watching her. His usual playful guard down, his gaze lingering with an intensity that made her breath catch. He reached over to the console and, on a whim, played a song. The soulful, yearning voice of Etta James filled the studio. "At last, my love has come along." Clara said nothing. She just listened, caught in the melody and the weight of his unreadable expression, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with cider and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. Success became a gilded cage. As the ratings for Morning Rush soared, the station entered its crucial spring rating season. The pressure from management, personified by an increasingly manic Brenda, was immense. The studio, once their accidental sanctuary, began to feel like a stage. "The listeners love the chemistry," Brenda announced one morning, waving a sheaf of printouts. "We need to up the ante, more personal stuff. I'm thinking an on-air date. We'll have listeners vote on where you go." Clara felt a wave of nausea. "Our private lives are not a programming gimmick, Brenda." "Leo, talk to her," Brenda pleaded. Leo leaned back in his chair, his easy charm now a thin, brittle shield. "You want chemistry?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or do you want us to sell tickets to our private lives? Because they are not the same thing." The line, once blurry, was now being erased entirely. For Clara, who craved control, the erosion of her private self was terrifying. For Leo, who used his charm to keep the world at arm's length, the monetization of his genuine, emerging feelings felt like a profound violation. The change was palpable. Their on-air banter, once electric with friction and wit, became a careful performance. They were actors playing themselves, and the strain was beginning to show. The breaking point came during a segment on regrets. The topic was Leo's idea, an attempt to steer back toward the authentic connection they had found. Clara, feeling a strange surge of recklessness, decided to participate. "I think my biggest regret," she began, her voice softer than usual, "is missing an opportunity because I was too afraid to be spontaneous, to deviate from the plan. I was so convinced that my way was the only way that I didn't realise what I was letting slip through my fingers until it was long gone." She wasn't talking about a job or a trip. She was talking about him, about the wall she'd built, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever said on a microphone. The phone lines glowed with callers sharing their own vulnerable stories. For a moment it felt real again, but Leo, stung by the constant pressure to perform and mistaking her confession for just another part of the act, missed it completely. After the show, as she was gathering her things, he walked past her desk. "Great performance today, Vance," he said, his voice cool and detached. "Brenda will be thrilled." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She had shown him a piece of her soul and he had called it a performance. He saw her as a character. Perhaps that's all she was. The carefully constructed bridge between them crumbled to dust. She retreated behind her professional wall, higher and colder than ever before. For the next few days, their on-air exchanges were brittle, sharp, and genuinely frigid. The silences between their barbs were heavy with unspoken anger. One afternoon, Leo put on the Etta James song, perhaps as a peace offering. As the first notes of At Last filled the studio, Clara reached over and, with a sharp, deliberate movement, switched to a traffic report. The listeners noticed. "What happened to Vance and Croft?" one tweet read. "They sound like they're getting a divorce." In the studio, the red on-air light, once a symbol of connection, now felt like an accusation, illuminating the vast, silent chasm that had opened between them. The storm broke over the city just after 9 p.m, a furious assault of wind and rain that lashed against the windows of the deserted WROA station. Inside, the only light came from the green glow of the audio console, casting long shadows across the studio where Clara was packing her bag. She was done. She would work from home, email her segments, do whatever it took to avoid the suffocating tension of sharing a room with Leo Croft. She was just zipping her briefcase when the studio door creaked open. It was Leo, his jacket dark with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked tired, stripped of his usual bravado. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Home," she said crisply, not looking at him. "I've arranged it with Brenda. It's more efficient this way." "Clara, stop!" She froze. He rarely used her first name. He walked closer, the scent of rain and damp wool filling the small space. The storm outside raged, a fitting soundtrack for the tempest that had been brewing between them for days. "I'm sorry," he said, and those words sounded as if they'd been pulled from somewhere deep inside him. What I said after the regrets segment, it was cruel, and it wasn't true. He paused, searching for the right words. "What you said about being afraid, I heard you. I heard the real you. I was just too much of a coward to admit it because it scared the hell out of me." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "All of this," he gestured around the studio, started to feel like they were stealing something that was just ours, and I panicked. I pushed you away because it was easier than admitting how much it meant to me." As he spoke, a small unnoticed light on a secondary panel flickered, from red to green. A power surge from the storm had triggered a glitch in the station's emergency broadcast system, silently patching the audio from their studio directly onto the airwaves. They were live, their private reckoning broadcast to every radio in the storm-swept city. But they, in their isolated world, had no idea. Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. "You thought I was performing," she whispered, the hurt still fresh. "You thought the one real thing I shared was fake." "No," he said, stepping closer still. The cool surface of the broadcast console was cold under her trembling fingers. I knew it was real. That's what terrified me, because I'm afraid all the time, Clara. This whole personality, he gestured to himself. This charming, chaotic guy. It's a script. One I've been improvising my whole life. And you are starting to see past it. And I am falling in love with you, Clara. The real you, not the one on the script. The confession hung in the air between them, more electric than any storm. She looked up at him, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and all the walls she had ever built turned to dust. She closed the small distance between them. He cupped her jaw, his hand surprisingly warm against her cool skin. His kiss was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. Hers was the answer. It deepened slowly, a language of its own, conveying all the arguments, all the longing, all the unspoken truths from the past weeks. It was a kiss of overwhelming relief, of profound recognition. Finally you see me. Finally I am seen. His other hand moved to the small of her back, pulling her close, not with force, but with a reverence that made a shudder run through her entire body. Their bodies pressed together, a fragile, explosive connection through their clothes, a dance of deep need and deeper tenderness. Every sigh, every soft sound seemed to carry a lifetime of waiting. In that moment, the entire city, huddled by their radios, heard the soft, unmistakable sounds of their first kiss. Then, just as his lips moved from her mouth to the sensitive skin of her neck, a frantic producer in the master control room, alerted by a flood of stunned calls, slammed a button. The broadcast was cut, plunging thousands of listeners into shocking, absolute silence. But inside the studio, the storm had finally broken. They pulled apart slightly, breathless, resting their foreheads together in the quiet aftermath. The green glow of the audio levels, which had captured the frantic rhythm of their heartbeats, settled back into a calm, steady line. They were off the air, but for the first time they were truly connected. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright. The city washed clean. The atmosphere inside WROA, however, was anything but calm. The broadcast was the only thing anyone was talking about. Clara and Leo walked into Brenda's office side by side, a silent, united front. Brenda looked up from a blizzard of paperwork, her expression a strange cocktail of fury, awe, and sheer, unadulterated glee. "Do you have any idea," she began, her voice low, "what you two have done?" She slammed a stack of ratings projections onto the desk. "You have created the single biggest radio event in this city's history. The advertisers are in a frenzy. The network is calling. Everyone wants to know what happens next." She leaned forward, her eyes pinning them both. "I should fire you for violating about 17 FCC regulations, but the numbers, my God, the numbers," she sighed, a sound of profound surrender. "So here's the choice. We can end the show, issue a public apology, and go our separate ways. Or you can continue. No more gimmicks, no more manufactured drama, just you on your own terms." The next morning at 6 a.m, a city held its breath. The red on-air light flicked on. For a long moment there was only the soft hum of the console. Then Leo's voice, stripped of all artifice, warm and sincere. "Good morning," he began. "For a while now you've been listening to a story. Some of it was planned, some of it wasn't. We've been Vance and Croft, a performance that got a little too real. What we'd like to do from now on is just talk." He looked across the console at Clara. She offered him a small, radiant smile and leaned into her microphone. She held no script. Her hands were resting, calm, on the table. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice rich with a warmth no one had ever heard from her on air before. "And this is Leo. It's a beautiful morning. Let's see what the day brings. Their banter was different now. It was gentle, teasing, and deeply intimate. They still disagreed about films, about the best way to make coffee, about a new piece of public art, but the arguments were laced with affection, the easy rhythm of two people who were learning the music of each other's souls. The listeners didn't just accept the change, they embraced it. They had been fans of the drama, but they fell in love with the truth. Weeks later, the morning sun streamed into an apartment filled with the scent of coffee and old books. It was Clara's space, a sanctuary of soft light and towering shelves that Leo was only now getting to know. He was in her small kitchen, humming softly as he poured 2 mugs of coffee, completely at home. She came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. The comfortable silence between them was a new kind of language, one that required no words. He turned in her embrace, his hands coming up to cup her face. "Good morning," he murmured, and kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss of comfort and promise, a conversation that had started in a storm and now continued in the quiet light of day. It spoke of shared futures and lazy Sunday mornings, of arguments resolved and vulnerabilities cherished. He lifted her easily into his arms, and she laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. He carried her from the kitchen into her bedroom, the sunlight following them. He laid her gently on the bed, and for a moment just looked at her, his eyes full of a tenderness that made her heart ache with happiness. As his hands began to trace the lines of her body, it was not with the frantic hunger of a first touch, but with the slow, reverent attention of a scholar memorizing a beloved, sacred text. It was a quiet, spiritual act of union, a final confirmation that the love their listeners had only heard was now the solid, breathing foundation of their lives. And so, in the quiet hum of a city waking up, they found their true frequency, not in the sound waves sent out to thousands, but in the gentle whisper shared between two hearts, finally, perfectly in tune. The Katahdin Promise. The rain had been a constant companion for 3 days, a merciless drumming beat against the hood of Alara's jacket. It wasn't the gentle, life-giving rain of poems, but a cold, aggressive torrent that turned the world to a monochrome blur of grey sky and brown mud. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since she'd stood on Springer Mountain, full of a desperate manufactured hope that to the weight of miles of wilderness could somehow rearrange the scattered pieces of her life. Almost a year ago she'd been in a cap and gown, the fabric itching against her neck, a fixed smile plastered on her face as relatives asked the same suffocating question. So, what's the plan? The plan. As if life were a blueprint you were handed with your diploma. Her friends had plans, consulting jobs, grad school, internships that blossomed into careers. Alara had a degree in literature and a hollow feeling in her chest. So she'd concocted an escape she'd framed as a plan, a through hike of the Appalachian Trail. It sounded brave, adventurous. It sounded like anything other than what it was, running away. She thought the trail would provide answers, that the rhythm of walking would pound clarity into her bones. Instead, it had only amplified the silence inside her, a vast emptiness that echoed the endless green tunnel of trees. A slick root, disguised by a layer of decaying leaves, caught her boot, sending her crashing down. Her knee slammed into a rock, and the impact sent a sickening jolt up her leg. She didn't even cry out. She just lay there, face half pressed into the mud, as the cold seeped through her waterproof layers, which had long ago surrendered. Every muscle already screaming from the relentless climbs and descents of the southern Appalachians now throbbed with a fresh wave of agony. "What am I even doing out here?" she whispered, the words swallowed by the storm. Her own voice sounded foreign, thin. Everyone else has a 5-year plan. I don't even have a 5-minute plan, just mud. And this cold that goes all the way to your bones. Maybe I'm just not built for this. Maybe I'm not built for anything. Tears finally came, hot and pointless against her rain-chilled skin. She pushed herself up, her movements slow and heavy, and leaned her back against the rough bark of an oak. The sucking sound of her boots pulling free from the mud was a sound of defeat. This wasn't a journey of self-discovery. It was a slow, painful surrender to the elements. With trembling, numb fingers, she fumbled inside her pack for her satellite messenger. She'd programmed a message before she left. "I'm done, come get me." It was for emergencies, but this felt like one, an emergency of the soul. Her thumb hovered over the send button. The thought of the subsequent phone calls, the mixture of relief and disappointment in her parents' voices, the quiet "I told you so" from her friends, it was a humiliation she could barely stomach. But the alternative, another day, another week of the misery, felt impossible. Her eyes fell to the trail guide tucked into the mesh pocket of her pack. The pages were swollen and warped from the damp, the ink slightly blurred. She pulled it out, her movements clumsy. Her finger traced the red line of the trail, past her current miserable position. Standing Bear Farm, the text read. A legendary hostel, a sanctuary. She'd read about it in the shelter logs, notes from hikers ahead of her praising its warmth, its ramshackle charm, its almost mythical status as a place to heal. It was just a few more miles. A deal. She made a deal with the part of herself that hadn't completely given up. She would get to Standing Bear Farm. She would get warm. She would have one last night in the strange transient community of the trail, and then, in the morning, she would quit. With that fragile pack, she pushed herself away from the tree, ignoring the protest of her bruised knee, and took one more squelching step north. Alara stumbled into Standing Bear Farm like a refugee seeking asylum. It wasn't a picturesque lodge, it was a chaotic, beautiful jumble of weathered wood buildings, prayer flags, and smiling bearded faces that all seemed to understand the exact kind of hell she'd just walked through. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and something wonderfully, unbelievably like hope. Someone pointed her toward an open bunk in the main hostel, and she dropped her heavy soaked pack with a thud that felt final. The shower was a miracle. For 20 minutes she stood under the stream of hot water, letting it wash away not just the grime of the trail, but the layers of despair that had clung to her like a second skin. She watched the mud swirl down the drain, a symbolic release of the Tennessee drownout. When she finally emerged, skin pink and pruned, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Dressed in her last set of clean, dry clothes, a pair of soft leggings and a worn-out t-shirt, she felt almost human again. Dusk was settling, and a communal fire was crackling in a large stone pit outside. Drawn by a sound that cut through the murmur of hiker chatter, she walked toward it. It was the sound of an acoustic guitar, its notes rich and clear in the cool evening air, accompanied by a voice that was pure, soulful folk. It was a sound of melancholic beauty, a ballad of lost paths and hard-won resilience. She saw him then, and the world tilted slightly on its axis. He was leaning against a porch post, bathed in the fire's golden glow, eyes closed as he sang. He had a strong jawline softened by a few days of stubble, and dark, wavy hair that fell across his forehead. But it was the raw, unguarded emotion in his voice that captured her, holding her motionless on a nearby bench. The song's lyrics spoke of a fastball that had lost its fear, of walking a new baseline, of trading a manicured field for a wild, untamed path. It felt like he was singing her own story, a story she didn't even have the words for yet. He strummed the final resonant chord, letting it hang in the air for a perfect, still moment. Then his eyes opened, and they found hers across the dancing flames. It wasn't a glance, it was a collision. The chatter of the other hikers, the crackle of the fire, the chirping of the crickets, It all faded into a muted hum. In his dark, intense eyes, she saw a flicker of the same weariness, the same searching that she felt in her own soul. For a second, she wasn't a quitter covered in mud. She was just seen. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, reaching his eyes. He shifted, his posture relaxing as the spell broke. The sounds of the evening rushed back in. "Hey, pretty little lady," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that was even better up close. "What's your name?" The question was so simple, yet her mind went completely blank. It was the kind of eye contact that makes you forget your own name. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Elora," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze still holding hers. "Liam, glad you made it, Elora." He said her name as if it were a song he was just learning to play, and in that moment, huddled in the warmth of a stranger's music and an even stranger's smile, Elara's carefully constructed plan to quit began to unravel. The next morning, Elara found Liam nursing a cup of coffee by the cold fire pit. The air was crisp, washed clean by the storm. Her plan had been to ask for a shuttle into the nearest town. Instead, she heard herself asking, "Which way are you headed?" "North," he said, a simple answer that felt like an invitation. Always north. They decided to hike together for a day. That day bled into a week, and soon the idea of hiking without him felt as foreign as the life she'd left behind. They fell into a rhythm, his long athletic strides pushing her thoughtful pace forcing him to notice the small wonders of the trail he'd been rushing past. Virginia unfolded before them, a seemingly endless stretch of green that had earned the name the Virginia Blues from countless hikers before them. But for Elara, it was anything but blue. It was the landscape of their beginning. The miles were filled with stories. He taught her how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to listen for the rustle of a black bear in the undergrowth. She taught him the names of the wildflowers that dotted the trailside: Trillium, Lady Slipper, Bloodroot. The trail became their confessional. Under the vast, starry skies at trail shelters, their voices low murmurs in the quiet of the woods, they unwrapped their pasts for each other. Liam spoke of the crushing pressure of being a top baseball prospect, the boy with the $1 million arm. He described the sharp, tearing pain in his shoulder that ended it all, and the deeper pain of losing the only identity he'd ever known. "The scout said I had $1 million arm," he said one night, his voice laced with old grief. "Turns out it only takes one bad throw to make it worthless." "Maybe its worth isn't about throwing a ball," Elara replied softly, her fingers tracing the constellations above them. "Maybe it's about being strong enough to hold a guitar, or my hand when I'm about to slip." She in turn spoke of her own quiet fears, the suffocating weight of an unwritten future, the feeling of being an imposter among her high-achieving peers. With Liam the words came easily, the shame lifting with each confession. He didn't offer solutions, he just listened, his presence a steady, comforting anchor. One sweltering afternoon they followed the sound of rushing water off trail and discovered a hidden swimming hole, a perfect emerald pool fed by a small waterfall. A mischievous look passed between them, a silent dare. Moments later their clothes were in piles on the sun-warmed rocks, and they were plunging into the shockingly cold water. Their gasps turned to laughter, a pure, unburdened sound that echoed off the rock walls. Under the water, his hand brushed against hers as they treaded water, and the jolt was more electrifying than the cold. In that sun-dappled sanctuary, they were just two people, free from their pasts, alive in the moment. Other hikers began to notice the easy orbit they had around each other. They were no longer just Elara and Liam. They were a unit. It was a grizzled, older hiker named Pops who gave them their trail names. Liam, for his legendary fastball and the easy way he could slide a story into any conversation, became Mula. Ilara, for her quiet, determined search for direction, became Compass's Rose. The names stuck, a new identity forged together on the trail. They were Slider and Compass Rose, a partnership growing closer with every mile, the slow burn of their connection warming them more than any campfire. The White Mountains of New Hampshire were a different beast entirely. The trail, which had been a rugged but manageable path, transformed into a series of near-vertical rock scrambles that demanded hands as well as feet. The climbs were longer, the descents more treacherous, and the weather, they were warned, was a fickle god. They had been hiking above the tree line for an hour, the world a breathtaking panorama of granite and sky when the change came. It started subtly. The brilliant blue sky hazed over, and a cool breeze whispered across the exposed ridge. Within minutes, the whisper became a howl, and dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled over the western peaks, racing toward them with unnatural speed. The temperature plummeted. Ilara zipped her fleece to her chin, her earlier awe turning to a knot of anxiety in her stomach. "We need to get lower," Liam's voice was calm but urgent, cutting through the rising wind. "Now!" But there was nowhere to go. They were on a narrow spine of rock, a stone walkway in the sky. Then came the first flash of lightning, a jagged tear in the dark clouds, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it felt like the mountain itself was splitting apart. Panic seized Ilara. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs freezing in place. Liam's hand found hers, his grip strong and sure. The casual, easygoing hiker was gone, replaced by the focused athlete he used to be. His eyes scanned the terrain, assessing, calculating. "This way!" he yelled over the wind, pulling her along. He led them, half scrambling, half sliding, off the main ridge, toward a jumble of massive boulders. Just as the first icy pellets of hail began to sting their faces, he found it. A deep alcove, a small cave formed by two house-sized rocks leaning against each other. He pushed her inside and followed, their bodies pressed together in the cramped space as the full fury of the storm broke around them. Wind shrieked, thunder crashed, and lightning illuminated their tiny sanctuary in stark, strobing flashes. Shivering, soaked and breathless, they huddled together, sharing body heat. The sheer terror of the last few minutes had stripped away every last pretense, every unspoken word that had lingered between them for months. He wrapped his arms around her, his body a solid, warm shield against the storm's rage. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her cheek. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression raw, his eyes dark with an emotion that made her heart ache. "I wasn't scared of the lightning," he said, his voice husky and low. "I was scared of losing you." His inner thought was a revelation. They say lightning never strikes the same place twice. They're wrong. It struck me the moment I saw her, and it was striking me again right now. Before she could answer, before she could even breathe, his lips were on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, fueled by months of unspoken feelings and the raw adrenaline of their survival. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and fear and a profound, overwhelming relief. She kissed him back with all the certainty she'd been searching for since she'd first set foot on the trail, her hands tangling in his wet hair, pulling him closer. In the heart of the storm, sheltered by ancient rock, they finally found their own safe harbour. The final climb to Katahdin began in the pre-dawn darkness, the beams of their headlamps cutting sharp cones of light through the cold, pine-scented air. They moved in a comfortable, practiced silence, a single unit against the immense challenge of Maine's greatest mountain. The trail was less a path than a puzzle of giant granite boulders, requiring them to hoist each other up, their movements a synchronized dance they had perfected over 2,000 miles. They were no longer two lost people searching for a way forward. They were a team, each the other's anchor and guide. As they cleared the tree line, the first hint of dawn painted the eastern horizon in pale shades of lavender and rose. The wind was a sharp, biting force, but they barely noticed, their focus entirely on the summit that loomed above them. When they finally pulled themselves over the last boulder and saw the iconic weathered sign, a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled Ilara's knees washed over them. Katahdin. Northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. They had made it. They touched the rough carved wood of the sign together, their fingers intertwining. A few other hikers, huddled against the rocks, cheered for them, their voices thin in the vast emptiness. "Congratulations, Slider and Compass Rose," one shouted, solidifying the identity they had built together. They were the Nobo couple, a small legend in the transient world of the trail. The sun broke free of the horizon, flooding the world below with a spectacular golden light. They stood on the roof of Maine, looking out at an endless sea of mountains and lakes, and then they looked at each other. Liam's eyes were full of a love so deep and certain it took Ilara's breath away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small smooth stone worn into the shape of a heart by some ancient river. He pressed it into her palm. "I came out here to figure out what to do without baseball," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Turns out the answer wasn't a what, it was a who. My dream isn't about pitching anymore, Rose, it's about writing songs and seeing where this path leads, as long as you're on it with me." Tears streamed down Ilara's face, freezing on her cheeks. She looked from the stone in her hand to the man in front of her, and for the first time in her life, her future felt absolutely clear. She hadn't needed to find a specific career or a perfectly mapped out plan. She'd needed to find her direction, her true north. "I came here to get away from the world," she whispered, her voice catching. "I ended up finding mine." And as the sun fully illuminated the wild, beautiful world below them, he kissed her. It was a kiss unlike the desperate one in the storm. This one was slow and deep and full of the quiet certainty of a sunrise. It was a kiss that held the memory of every mile, every struggle, and every shared laugh. It was the Katahdin Promise. The Appalachian Trail doesn't give you the answers you think you're looking for. It just gives you the miles, the silence, and the strength to finally ask the right questions. And if you're lucky, it gives you the person you're meant to ask them with for the rest of your life. Embers of Wildflower Hill. The summer of 1895 arrived in the valley like a whispered promise. It settled over Wildflower Hill Farm in waves of golden light that poured through the kitchen windows, illuminating the dance of dust motes in the air. For me, Cora May, each morning was a replica of the last, a litany of chores set to the rhythm of birdsong and the distant Sunday morning chime of church bells from the town I could see but rarely visited. I was a creature of routine, my world contained by the farm's fences and the sharp, ever-present voice of my guardian, Mrs. Whitmore. "Cora, the bread will burn if you stand there daydreaming," she called from the porch, her voice cutting through the gentle morning symphony like a scythe through wheat. A girl who just turned 18 ought to have more sense than a goose. I flinched, turning from the window to the scent of yeast and warmth. My life was a series of small, contained tasks, kneading dough, churning butter, mending linens. It was a safe life, a debt I was meant to repay with silent obedience. Mrs. Whitmore had taken me in from the county orphanage. It was the place where foundlings like me, left as infants on the church steps, waited for a life to begin. She chose me when I was 5, and she never let me forget that my existence was her act of charity, a debt I was meant to repay with silent obedience. My dreams were an indulgence we couldn't afford. That morning, however, the routine was broken. As I carried a pail of fresh milk toward the cool of the root cellar, a horse and wagon I didn't recognise crested the hill. It was driven by a man whose clothes were not of our valley. He wore a crisp, light-coloured suit, a city hat perched on his head, and his posture was one of easy confidence that seemed alien against the backdrop of our weathered barns and sprawling fields. He pulled his horse to a gentle stop near the porch, his eyes scanning the property with a thoughtful curiosity I'd never seen before. Men here looked at the land for what it could yield: corn, hay, potatoes. This man looked at it as if he were listening to a secret it was telling. He tipped his hat toward Mrs. Whitmore, who stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of suspicion. "Good morning, madame. My name is Julian Ashford. I'm a surveyor from Boston, looking for the Ashford property line." Mrs. Whitmore's expression sharpened, her eyes narrowing on his face. "Ashford, you say? It's a bold thing, a city Ashford coming back to look at the land your family abandoned. What business could you have here now?" The gentle smile on his face tightened slightly, but he held her gaze. "It remains my family's land, madam, and my business is to survey it. I've been tasked with mapping what was left behind." It was then that he saw me, standing frozen halfway to the cellar, the milk pail heavy in my hands. His gaze was direct, yet kind. It wasn't the appraising look of the farmhands or the dismissive glance of the town gentry. It was a look of genuine, quiet observation. In that moment, a nervous tremor ran through me, and my grip on the pail handle slipped. The pail clattered to the dirt, sending a cascade of white milk and tin cups scattering across the yard. A hot flush of shame burned my cheeks. "Clumsy girl," Mrs. Whitmore snapped, but Julian was already off his wagon before the words had fully landed. He knelt, not minding the dirt on his fine trousers, and began gathering the cups. His hands were long and elegant, yet smudged with what looked like ink stains around the fingers. "It happens to the best of us," he said, his voice low and meant only for me. He handed me the cups, his fingers brushing against mine. His touch was a spark against the cool morning air. "Your hands," he observed softly, looking at my trembling fingers, "shake like autumn leaves." I couldn't find my voice to answer. I could only stare at the ink stains, the kindness in his eyes, at this man who had stepped out of another world and into the middle of my own. Later that evening, long after the supper dishes were cleaned and Mrs. Whitmore was asleep, I sat at my small bedroom window. A single lamp burned in the distance, a point of gold against the deepening indigo of the hills. It was him. Julian had set up his camp near the edge of the Ashford land. I could see his silhouette against the lamplight as he bent over a large drawing board, a pencil moving deftly in his hand. He wasn't conquering the land, he was learning its language, translating its contours onto paper. I watched for what felt like hours. The world outside my window suddenly vast and filled with a thrilling, terrifying possibility. I'd never seen a man who looked at the world as if it was something beautiful to be preserved rather than conquered. And as he worked under the silent watch of the stars, I felt a part of myself, a part I hadn't even known was dormant, begin to stir and awaken. The valley was the same, but for the first time I felt the promise of a different view. The days that followed were filled with a secret current of anticipation. I performed my chores with a new, quiet energy, my senses tuned to the distant sound of Julian's work, the metallic clink of his surveying equipment, the soft thud of a wooden stake being driven into the earth. I found excuses to be outdoors, my eyes always drifting toward the overgrown fields that separated our farm from the forgotten Ashford land. It was during one of these stolen moments, while picking a bunch of wild Queen Anne's lace near the crumbling stone wall of the old mill, that he found me. I was so lost in thought, tracing the delicate web-like pattern of a flower, that I didn't hear him approach. "They look like constellations, don't they?" His voice startled me, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Julian stood there, holding not a tool, but a sketchbook. A gentle smile played on his lips, each one a tiny galaxy. I clutched the wildflowers to my chest. I never thought of it that way. That's the secret to everything, he said, taking a step closer. Perspective. The same view can look entirely different depending on where you stand. He opened his sketchbook, and my breath caught. It was filled with breathtakingly detailed drawings, the gnarled trunk of an oak tree, the precise architecture of a dragonfly's wing, the sweep of the valley as seen from the hill. And there, on a fresh page, was a light sketch of the old mill, its stones rendered with a loving, meticulous hand. "You make things beautiful," I whispered, mesmerised. "I don't make them beautiful," he corrected gently. "I just try to see the beauty that's already there." He gestured to the flower in my hand. "May I?" He took out a graphite pencil and turned to a new page in his book. "Let me show you." He guided me to sit on the sun-warmed stone wall, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the sound of water trickling over stones in the nearby creek. He began to sketch the Queen Anne's lace, explaining the way the light fell, the importance of shadow, the fine art of seeing. To show me a curve, he placed the pencil in my hand and gently enclosed his fingers over mine, guiding my knuckles. A tremor went through me at the contact, the warmth of his skin, the slight pressure of his hand, the shared purpose of creating a line on paper. It was the most intimate touch I had ever known. In that dappled sunlit sanctuary, walls began to crumble, not just the stone ones around us, but the ones I had built around my heart. Emboldened by his kindness, I confessed a secret I had guarded for years. "I can read," I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "Mrs. Whitmore thinks it's a waste of time for a girl. She doesn't know." Julian's eyes lit up with a profound respect that felt more nourishing than any praise I'd ever received. He didn't pity me, he celebrated me. The next afternoon he returned to our spot by the mill. He didn't bring his sketchbook. He brought a small leather-bound book. The gold lettering on the spine read, "The Poetical Works of John Keats." He opened it to a page marked with a pressed violet. "Do you know what beauty is, Cora?" he asked, his voice soft as he read the lines aloud. His voice gave the words a life I'd never imagined. "Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth, and all you need to know." He looked up at me, his gaze intense. "It isn't just about pretty things. It's about honesty, sincerity, courage. Beauty is courage made visible." He left the book with me. That night I read Keats by candlelight, the scent of crushed wildflower petals rising from the pages. His poem spoke of nightingales and Grecian urns, of love and loss so profound it made my chest ache. But it was Julian's words that echoed in my mind, courage made visible. With each passing day in our hidden garden of possibility, I felt that courage taking root inside me. He was teaching me about perspective, not just in drawing, but in life. He saw the world as a place of wonder, and when he looked at me, I started to believe I could be a part of it. The warmth of his shoulder brushing against mine as we looked at his sketches, the shared silence broken only by the creek's murmur, the secret knowledge of the book hidden beneath my mattress, these were the seeds of a new world. I had lived in this valley all my life, surrounded by its rolling hills and familiar seasons, but as I told him one late afternoon, my voice trembling with the truth of it, "I've never really seen it until you showed me how to look." The sky had been a deceptive, brilliant blue all day, but as twilight began to bleed across the horizon, a bruised purple stain appeared in the west. The air grew heavy and still, the birds falling silent. I was helping Julian measure the foundation of the old Ashford house, holding one end of his long measuring tape, when the first fat drop of rain hit my cheek, then another, and another. Within moments, the heavens opened. A torrential downpour, cold and violent, swept across the hills. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. "The barn!" Julian shouted over the roar, grabbing my hand and his satchel of drawings. We ran, slipping on the wet grass, the rain plastering my thin, cotton dress to my skin and his hair to his forehead. We stumbled into the cavernous, hay-scented darkness of the old mill barn just as another peal of thunder rolled through the valley like the footfalls of a giant. The rain hammered on the wooden roof, a deafening, relentless drumbeat. Inside, the world shrank to just the two of us, surrounded by shadows and the smell of old wood, dry hay, and the approaching storm. A flash of lightning illuminated the space, freezing us for a second in a stark silver tableau, his hand still holding mine, our chests heaving from the run. He let go of my hand, but the warmth lingered. He moved to the large barn doors, peering out at the tempest. "It looks like we'll be here a while." The storm outside seemed to mirror the one gathering inside me. In the close, charged atmosphere of the barn, all pretense fell away. We were no longer surveyor and farm girl, teacher and student. We were just a man and a woman sheltered from the same storm. He turned from the door, his face cast in shadow. "I've been drawing other people's dreams for so long, I forgot I had my own," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the echoing space. He told me of his life in Boston, of a father who saw architecture as a business of status and wealth, not art. He was meant to design opulent mansions for men he didn't respect, to marry a woman chosen for her family's connections, to live a life that was a perfect, beautiful blueprint of someone else's desires. His vulnerability was a key, unlocking a door in my own heart. I found myself telling him things I had never spoken aloud, of the cold loneliness of the orphanage, of the gnawing fear of being unwanted that had been my constant companion. "Sometimes I feel invisible," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper, "like a ghost in my own life." He moved closer, his expression achingly tender in the gloom. "You are the least invisible person I have ever met, Cora." Another flash of lightning lit his feet, and in that split second, I saw the raw emotion there, a longing that mirrored my own. He raised his hand, his fingers gently brushing a rain-soaked strand of hair from my cheek. The touch was electric. The thunder outside seemed to beat in time with my own heart. He leaned in and the world stopped. His lips met mine, and it was nothing like the chaste fantasies I might have entertained. It was tender and desperate, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of rain and salt, the rain on his skin and the single tear that escaped my eye and traced a path down my face. The kiss deepened, breaking a dam inside me. All the yearning, all the unspoken hopes, all the feelings I had no names for rushed to the surface in a wave of consuming heat. He pulled me closer, his arms wrapping around me, holding me as if I were the most precious thing in the world. In the heart of the storm, I felt utterly, completely safe and yet more thrillingly endangered than I had ever been. He broke the kiss only to press his lips to my neck, his breath hot against my rain-cooled skin. My head fell back, a silent surrender to the sensations he was awakening. With a groan that seemed pulled from his very soul, he guided me backward and we sank down into a pile of soft, sweet-smelling hay. The rustle of it was a whisper joining the drumming of the rain on the roof. His hands, the same hands that could render the world with such delicate precision on paper, were now learning the lines of my body with a desperate, wonderful urgency. He unlaced the bodice of my dress, his fingers fumbling slightly, a sign of a passion that overrode his usual grace. The cool air hit my skin as he peeled away the damp cotton, his gaze following the path of his hands. There was no shame in his eyes, only a profound, breathtaking reverence that made me feel beautiful for the first time in my life. He lowered his head, his lips tracing a fiery path along my collarbone, down into the valley between my breasts. I gasped, my fingers tangling in his damp hair, pulling him closer. This was desire. This was a choice. Each touch was a question he was asking, and my every shuddering breath was an answer. My own hands grew bold, exploring the hard planes of his back, the surprising strength in his shoulders. I helped him with the buttons of his shirt, my fingers brushing against the solid warmth of his chest. When our skin met, it was like lightning, a jolt of pure feeling that arced between us. He was real, solid, and warm beneath my hands. When our bodies finally joined, it was a moment of absolute breathtaking clarity. Sharp gasp of pain and pleasure left my lips, a sound that was instantly swallowed by his kiss. He held himself still above me, his eyes locked on mine, waiting. In that gaze I gave him my trust, and he met it with a tenderness that shattered me. He moved, slowly at first, a rhythm that matched the steady, insistent rain outside, a rhythm that was building a new world inside the forgotten barn. It was not a surrender, but a claiming of myself, of him, of this one perfect stolen moment in time where we were the only two souls in existence. The hay pricked my skin, the thunder rolled in the distance, and the only thing I could feel was him, a glorious, undeniable presence that filled all my senses. Later, as we lay tangled in limbs and hay, the storm outside having softened to a steady rhythmic drumming, I traced the line of his jaw. My voice, when I found it, was a raw whisper against his chest. "You make me feel like I exist." He gathered me closer, his arm a solid weight of possession and protection around me. I could feel the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. "You make me feel like I'm finally building something for myself." Just then, a faint, sharp sound cut through the rain. "Cora! Cora! Where are you?" It was Mrs. Whitmore's voice, a cold blade of reality slicing through our sanctuary. The spell was broken. I understood then that love was not gentle. It was a wildfire that consumed everything you thought you knew about yourself, leaving you raw and exposed and utterly transformed in its wake. And as I gathered my clothes in the shadows, the scent of hay and rain and him clinging to my skin, I knew that I could never go back to the girl I was before the storm. The world after the storm felt muted, holding its breath. For 3 days, a profound silence settled over Wildflower Hill. Julian was gone. His camp was still there, a lonely canvas tent by the woods, but he did not appear at our garden by the mill, nor did his lamp burn late into the night. An agonizing knot of fear and doubt tightened in my chest. The memory of the barn, the thunder, his touch, his whispered confessions felt like a fever dream. Had I imagined it all? On the evening of the 3rd day, my anxiety became unbearable. After Mrs. Whitmore had retired, her snores a rhythmic counterpoint to my frantic heartbeat, I slipped out of the house. A sliver of moon offered just enough light to guide my path toward his camp. My bare feet were silent on the damp earth. I saw him as I cleared the tree line. He was packing. His surveying tools were already boxed, his drawing board wrapped in oilcloth. He was folding his tent with a grim mechanical efficiency. My heart plummeted. He was leaving. "Julian?" My voice was a fragile thing in the vast quiet. He froze, his back to me. When he finally turned, his face was a portrait of anguish. He looked pale, haunted. "Cora, you shouldn't be here." "You're leaving," I stated, the words tasting like ash. Without a word. "I had to go to town," he said, his voice strained. "There was a telegram." He wouldn't meet my eyes. He reached for his coat, which lay draped over a crate, and as he lifted it, a single white envelope fluttered to the ground. Neither of us moved for a second. It lay there between us, stark against the dark grass. I bent and picked it up. My fingers recognized the expensive, crisp paper. It wasn't addressed to him. It was an invitation. My eyes scanned the elegant, looping script, and the words seemed to burn themselves into my mind. "Mr. and Mrs. Alistair Thornfield request the pleasure of your company to celebrate the engagement of their daughter, Miss Margaret Thornfield and Mr. Julian Ashford. The air left my lungs in a single silent gasp. The world tilted, the trees swaying as if they would fall. I looked from the pristine white card to his tormented face, and a cold, sharp rage I had never known began to smoulder within me. Was I just another landscape for you to survey and abandon? I asked, my voice trembling with a fury that was utterly new to me. I held up the invitation. Was this part of your study? The naive farm girl? Another pretty sketch to add to your collection? No, Cora, no, it's not like that, he said, stepping toward me, his hands outstretched. Please, let me explain. Explain this. I thrust the invitation at him. The paper tore slightly in my grip. His desperation was palpable, his words tumbling out in a torrent of misery. It's an arrangement. My family's. It was made years ago. My father's business is failing. Her family is wealthy. It's a merger, not a marriage. It's about obligation and debt. It has nothing to do with love, nothing to do with how I feel about you. How you feel about me, I laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You feel so much that you are going to disappear without a trace? I didn't know what to do, he cried, his voice cracking. I came back from town today to pack my things and tell you, I swear it, this life, this engagement, it's a prison. You, Cora, you are the only real thing in it. I would give up everything for you, but I have nothing to give. My name, my inheritance, it's all tied to this. His words, meant to be a comfort, were a confirmation of the terrible truth. I was his secret, his escape, the wildflower he could appreciate in a hidden garden, but could never wear on his lapel in the drawing rooms of Boston. The storm in the barn was our sanctuary, but it was also our cage, a place outside of his real life. I stood there, the torn invitation clutched in my hand, the single candle in my distant bedroom window, the only warm light in a world that had gone cold. He was trapped, yes, but he was asking me to be trapped with him, to accept the stolen moments, the hidden affections, the life lived in the shadows of his obligations. And in that moment of devastating clarity, I realized the choice wasn't his to make alone. It was mine. The girl who felt invisible was gone. The woman standing before him would not be someone's secret. She would not trade one cage for another, no matter how beautifully gilded. Love without courage is just another cage, Julian, I said, my voice steady now with a resolve forged in the fire of this betrayal. And I've lived in enough cages for one lifetime. I dropped the torn letter at his feet, turned, and walked back toward the farmhouse, not looking back. I didn't hear him call my name. I heard only the sound of my own ragged breathing, and the distant lonely sound of his horse being hitched to his wagon, preparing to depart. A week passed. The air turned crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. The vibrant greens of Wildflower Hill began to be tinged with strokes of gold and rust, the world changing its colours around me. I changed with it. The searing pain of Julian's departure cooled into a hard, clear resolve. I did not weep. Instead, I read. I devoured the book of Keats, not for the romance, but for the strength I found in its pages. I helped Mrs. Whitmore with the chores, my movements sure and steady, my silence no longer one of meekness, but of contemplation. During that week, I did something I had never dared to do. I hitched our old mare to the cart and drove myself into town. I walked into the county schoolhouse and spoke to the headmistress, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Gable. I told her I could read and write, that I knew my numbers, and that I wanted to learn how to teach. I showed her my penmanship. She looked at me over her spectacles, her gaze sharp and appraising. She saw not a charity case, but a mind hungry for purpose. She offered me a position, assisting her, with the chance to become a teacher in the small school in the next county come spring. It wasn't a grand life, but it would be my own. I returned to the farm feeling a sense of ownership over my own destiny for the first time. I had a plan that did not involve waiting for a man to choose me. I was choosing myself. Then at dawn on the 8th day, as the morning mist was lifting from the valley like a slow-rising curtain, I saw a figure walking up the path. It was Julian. He was on foot, his fine city clothes replaced by simple, sturdy trousers and a worn shirt. He carried no surveying equipment, no sketchbooks. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He didn't come to the farmhouse. He went to our garden by the old mill, as if he knew that was where he might find me. And he was right. I was already there, waiting. I had been drawn there by some instinct, a feeling that our story was not yet finished. He stopped a few feet from me, his hands empty at his sides. "I broke the engagement," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I spoke to my father. I told him I would not be a part of the arrangement. He disowned me. I have forfeited my inheritance, my position, everything." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "I came to ask you to come to Boston with me, Cora. I have nothing but my hands and my heart to offer you. I can find work. I can draw, I can build. We would have nothing, but we would have each other. A year ago, a week ago, his words would have been a rescue, a dream come true. But I was not the same girl. I smiled, a small, sad but powerful smile. "I cannot go to Boston as the woman you support, Julian," I said, and I saw a flash of pain in his eyes before I continued. "But I will go as your partner." I told him about my meeting with Mrs. Gable, about the teaching position, about the life I had begun to build for myself in the ashes of my heartbreak. "I have my own future now," I explained, "my own work to do." Understanding dawned on his face, replaced by a look of profound, breathtaking admiration. This was the perspective he had taught me to see. He wasn't saving me. We were meeting as equals, two people who had chosen to dismantle their old lives to build a new one. "Then we shall go together," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You will teach, and I will build. We will make our own fortune, our own home." He stepped forward and took my hands in his. His touch was no longer just a spark of desire. It was a steady, grounding force. "Let me come with you." And so we chose each other, not out of dependency or desperation, but out of a shared vision for a life built on courage. The next morning we stood on the platform at the train station. I carried a small travelling bag containing a change of clothes, the Book of Keats, and a single pressed wildflower from our garden. From the farmhouse window on the hill, I could just make out the silhouette of Mrs. Whitmore watching us go. I felt not anger, but a strange sort of pity for her, for a life lived within such rigid fences. As the train pulled away with a great hiss of steam and a hopeful whistle, I pressed my face to the window and watched Wildflower Hill grow smaller in the distance. The girl who had never dared to dream beyond the next sunrise was gone forever. In her place sat a woman who had learned that the greatest act of love is not surrendering yourself to another, but becoming fully yourself, and then choosing to share that self with someone brave enough to do the same. Julian's hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own. It felt not like a rescue, but like a promise, that we would build our own garden wherever we planted ourselves and tend it together. And as the train carried us toward an uncertain future, the morning light pouring in, I knew we were finally heading home.